Now, the more complicated a quadratic equation gets, the more techniques you need to have available in order to solve it efficiently. And one of the techniques that we're going to use, we remember from algebra, that's factoring. So for example, let's recall if a question in algebra asked us to factor an expression like x squared plus 6x minus 8. What that means is we want to write the expression as a product. That's what it means to factor, to write it as a product. Two things multiplied together. And so we want to figure out what numbers to put here. Now, if you actually expand this out, the idea is you would take this x times x, that's where you get x squared from. Then you would take this number multiplied by x, and this number multiplied by x. And I'm using a question mark in both places, but these question marks could refer to different numbers. And then finally, you have to take these two question mark numbers and multiply those together. So you end up with an expression of the same form as the one you started with. And what happens here is when you multiply those two numbers together, you have to get this 8. And when you add those two numbers together, you have to get this 6. So that's what we're looking for. The numbers we pick inside these factors should add together to give us 6 and multiply together to give us 8. And if you think about it for a moment, you'll realize that the numbers 2 and 4 work for this. If I have 2 and 4, 2 plus 4 is 6, 2 times 4 is 8, that's what we want. So those are the values we can use to write in this expression to get the factored form of x squared plus 6x plus 8. And it would be equally valid to write these in the opposite order. If you want to write x plus 4 times x plus 2 instead, that's the same thing. Now let's see how this can help us to solve a quadratic equation. Let's solve the equation x squared plus 6x plus 8 equals 0. So notice the previous problem was not an equation to solve, but it did remind us how to factor just the left side. And so this is the same thing as we had on the previous slide, so we can use that result to help us factor it. So the left side can be rewritten as x plus 2 times x plus 4. And our equation says that when we multiply those together, we're supposed to get 0. Now, if you multiply two numbers together and get 0, one of them has to be 0. So that means either the first number here, the x plus 2, is 0, or the second number, the x plus 4, is 0. One of those has to be 0, which means either x is negative 2, which you get from isolating x in the first equation, or x is 4, which is what you get from isolating x in the second equation. This is it. This is the idea and how factoring helps us to solve a quadratic equation. Factor, set each of the factors equal to 0, and then solve each of the resulting equations. For another example, imagine we start with 2x squared equals 10x plus 12. In order to answer this, the first thing I want to do is write it in the same form, something equal to 0. So I move the 10x and the 12 over to the other side by subtracting. I can also make my work a little bit simpler if I divide by the greatest common factor here, which is 2. That's going to make all my coefficients smaller, and that's usually a good idea because it makes it a little bit easier to see what numbers you'll need to use when you factor. And in particular, I'm going to factor. I want numbers that add together to give me negative 5, multiply together to give me negative 6. And it turns out that negative 6 and positive 1 do the trick. Now that I've factored the left side, I have this times this equals 0. That means one of those factors has to be 0. And taking the two equations that you get from setting each factor equal to 0, solving each of them for x gives you the two solutions of the original equation.